The Encircling Bower Theatre, Yanmas, Taldor, early winter, 4718. About 24 hours ago, Grand Princess Eutropia had been assassinated by a killer clad in the garments of Norgorber, one of the many dark allies fostered by a reclusive secret society of immortals in Taldor calling itself the Immaculate Circle. Since then, time had become a blur. Aurelius's teleportation magic had allowed them to confer with their close ally Martella Lothide in their old home base in Marat. They had spoken with an apparent defector from the Immaculate Circle, and from her they had learned of the existence of a device called the Soul Crucible, which had been used to resurrect Prince Carius long after his death. With it, the party hoped to resurrect Princess Eutropia, and perhaps save Taldor from the machinations of the most feared lord of the Immaculate Circle, Panavar Lothide, a wizard who they had dispatched a month ago, but whose far-reaching schemes had survived his apparent destruction. Their quest had brought them to the Encircling Bower Theatre, where Panavar's most trusted expert in resurrections, a man named Vadragan Pole, had worked. His old base of operations had not been empty when they arrived. A panoply of their old foes had been waiting for them: Pole's golems, his monks of Raumia, Rakshasas of the Seven Sins, Norgorberite assassins, and of course Panavar's most dangerous minions, the horrifying Sakels. The party had not come to the theatre alone. They had brought with them two of their old friends from previous adventures, Sepsinia Crabby and Galindra Jondrek. The conflict in the lower level had been fast but brutal, and Galindra had caught the wrong end of a Rakshasa's kukri. She was beyond saving at this point, while Sepsinia remained in the hall, still clutching the hand of her friend, as her anthropomorphic piglet companion rested a supporting hand on her shoulder. The rest of the party scattered about the lower level, looking for clues as to the whereabouts of the Soul Crucible. Among the rooms beneath the caravanserai they uncovered a prop storage, a cramped, unlit room lined with shelves and filled with lumber, jars of paint, and other such materials, a recreation room featuring a small circular table surrounded by chairs. A playset of cards had been laid out, as if the players had been interrupted mid-game. This was obviously where the assassins had been when they had been alerted by noise from the fight in the hall. A small prison, beyond the rec room a small single cell. Demi surmised this was probably where they had been keeping their ally Katheer before the cult had moved to the caravanserai. Two small barracks rooms with bunks and storage units. These surrounded a large training room filled with dummies and including a sparring circle. The party imagined this might be where both the Rakshasa and the monks of Raumia practiced their martial arts. Finally, there was a large planning room. The party entered the planning room cautiously, their weapons still drawn, and eyes scanning for any lurking threats. The chamber was well maintained, its walls adorned with lavish tapestries depicting swirling cosmic patterns. A simple altar stood against the north wall, its stone surface stained dark. Whether from wax ink or something more sinister was unclear. There were also no markings on it to indicate which deity this might be consecrated to, but Marius remembered the shrine to the Sakil tormentor Velgas, located beneath the caravanserai, so he strode over and shattered this altar as well, just for good measure. As he did so, Diyanah examined the floor around the altar. Something very heavy had once been here. The stone was scuffed where it had been moved. He waved Demi over to have a look. Elsewhere, on a table in the eastern alcove, alongside several chairs that had been hastily pushed aside, scattered papers and scrolls had been strewn about. Aurelius examined these, but gleaned nothing more than the fact that this room was for strategy and secrecy, a nerve center for the cult's operations. The most unusual feature lay at the western end of the chamber, a large wooden platform beneath a trapdoor set in the ceiling. Mounted on a metal pivot arm nearby was an enormous brightly polished mirror, angled in such a way that it seemed meant to reflect light from above. Rankle was the first to understand its function. The mirror, it's used to let someone below see what's happening on stage. He gestured towards the trapdoor's obvious lock. The theatre was not actually in use, so Vadragan kept this lock down. It's a shame. If I had known, we could have picked the lock and surprised them from a different angle. In addition to all this in the planning room, there were two more rooms that had joined with it. Vadragan's bedroom had been stripped bare. He had taken everything of import with him to the caravanserai when the cult had decided to move its operations there. The other room had a small prison. A couple makeshift crowns, as if someone had been experimenting with designs, hung on hooks here. This is where they must have kept Carius before they moved him onto the caravanserai as well. Meanwhile, Demi had traced the scuff marks from the altar to the far wall beyond the small circular table. There were markings on the wall, but they had faded with time. "Aurelius," she called out, "come and take a look at this, and bring Panavar's ring with you." Aurelius slipped the ring on, and sure enough he felt a pull towards the door. "Yeah, there's a passage here, between this place and Panavar's demi-plane. It's like Nenarine said. I can use the ring to open it. The demi-plane is connected with the realm of the Sackles, or at least that's what Hao Jin said, noted Rankle. So the place will probably be crawling with them, but it seems pretty clear that's where the Soul Crucible is, so that's where we have to go. Yeah, said Marius in a short grunt of acknowledgement. Then he stepped out into the hall, gingerly picked up Galindra's corpse, and laid her to rest in Panavar's spacious bed in the adjoining room. Diyanah went to speak with Sepsinia. This next leg, it's going to be hard, I think, and we've already lost one person today. I think you should stay behind, keep watch over Galindra, and just make sure this theater stays secure. Sepsinia nodded through her tear-streaked face. Diyanah also turned to Pepper the Ferocious. Look after her while we're gone, he instructed. Pepper gave Diyanah a serious look and a formal military salute. Then Aurelius began to activate Panavar's ring, and sure enough, the paint on the wall began to flake off. The symbols which had been etched into the stone appeared to glow, and in short order they were looking down a long hall constructed of large ceramic white tiles streaked with red marbling. The roofing of the hall was metallic, decorated with old pipes, and lit periodically by what Demi would have described as galvanic lights that felt like they hummed overhead. "This is it," said Diyanah. "This is the place I saw Panavar when he entered my dreams at the Palace of Birdsong." "We come at last to the rusted dreaming," muttered Demi under her breath. Aurelius cast another invisibility sphere. Marius, Diyanah, and Raja led the way. Aurelius, Demi, and Rankle followed close behind to keep concealed. The long corridor opened into a wide entryway. The party stepped cautiously into the chamber. The walls here were constructed of blocks of varying shapes and sizes, fitted together like the pieces of a massive ancient puzzle. Along the two long walls, an intricate canopy of crimson silken cords stretched from ceiling to floor, fastened to iron rings embedded deep in the stone. The strands wove together in an unsettling pattern, like the web of some immense unseen creature forming a massive cocoon that filled the chamber. Despite the suffocating tangle of cords, a single path remained clear, leading towards a pair of looming double doors at the end. And there, nestled within the strands like bloated parasites waiting to be roused, 4 gaunt figures stirred. Their skin was stretched thin over jutting bones, and they were deathly pale, with sunken eyes that gleamed with a feverish hunger. Each one was hooked into the columns, suspended among the cords as though slumbering in a grotesque cradle. But as the party stepped forward, the creatures' heads snapped towards them in unison, their lips peeled back to reveal jagged, yellow fangs. The air grew heavier. Then with a wet, tearing sound, the vampire spawn wrenched themselves free from their perches and dropped into crouches upon the silken strands, their limbs tensed, coiled like starving beasts ready to pounce. Rankle exhaled sharply. "Blood scent," he observed. "They know we're here." Demi grimaced. "You know, Aurelius, your invisibility spells are proving less and less efficacious." "Yeah, I noticed," said Aurelius, grimly, readying a spell. The vampire spawn hissed in unison, dropping into a couch atop the silken strands, their clawed fingers tensed like spiders poised to strike. Then, as one, they leapt. Marius met the first vampire mid-air, raising his shield to absorb the impact as the creature's claws scraped across its polished surface. With a fluid motion, he shoved the monster back and retaliated, slamming Coriana's blade into its exposed torso. The dagger's ancient magic burned the vampire's pallid flesh. The creature shrieked, recoiling. Marius didn't need to give chase. The enormous figure of Raja leapt over him and descended onto the prone vampire. Diyanah, meanwhile, barely seemed to touch the ground as he wove through the charging enemies. He struck the second vampire with a brutal flame-wreathed palm strike to the chest, sending it tumbling back into the web of cords. The strands snapped and recoiled as the creature thrashed, snarling and shrieking in frustration. The monk pressed his advantage, using the unstable surface to maneuver unpredictably, his fists hammering into his foe like twin meteorites. The third vampire had tried to flank Marius, but Rankle was faster. He darted forward and intercepted the creature, his twin scimitars flashing. The vampire twisted away from the first strike, but Rankle anticipated this. With a flourish, he spun Flame Tongue in a downward arc, catching the monster across the side. Fire licked at its tattered robe as it shrieked and lunged in fury. But Rankle was already gone, his fey reflexes carrying him out of reach before the creature could retaliate. "Not fast enough," he taunted, slashing out again. The vampire howled as its arm severed at the elbow, its blackened flesh bubbling with the flames. The fourth vampire leapt towards Demi, its claws extended for her throat. But before it could reach her, it slammed into an invisible barrier mid-air. It hung there for a moment, claws scrabbling uselessly against an unseen force. Aurelius smirked, lowering his hands from the arcane gesture. "Not a chance." Demi took full advantage of its momentary suspension. She leveled Dignity's barb and fired 3 consecutive shots, each bolt slamming into the creature's chest. It let out a final gurgling wail before exploding in a burst of blood and gore. Seeing their companion pop like a blood balloon, the remaining 3 vampires hissed in unholy rage, but they were outmatched. Diyanah landed a final thunderous blow to his opponent, crushing its skull with the sheer force of the punch. Marius slashed his blade across the second vampire's throat, severing its head in a clean arc, and Rankle, grinning wickedly, drove his flaming sword through the last vampire's heart, pinning it to the column. With each death, the vampires burst, some curious property of this particular hellish breed. Thankfully, the party proved resistant to the poisonous blood they emitted on death. The room fell silent, the strands of silk still trembling from the violence, but the threat had been extinguished. Aurelius cast prestidigitation to drive the blood out of his robes. Well, that was unpleasant. Marius breathed heavily. Think someone may have heard that? Demi shrugged. Only one way to find out. With that, the party pressed forward, towards the double doors at the end of the hall. The air grew thick with an eerie stillness as the party stepped into a long descending tunnel. Unlike the jagged masonry of the previous chamber, the stone here had been carefully smoothed and draped with long swaths of silk, stretching along the walls like the glistening coils of some great serpent. The fabric rippled faintly in an unseen draught, making the tunnel feel almost alive, its winding path leading ever downwards into the unknown. The descent was gradual, but the oppressive atmosphere deepened with each step, its twists and turns obscuring any sense of distance. No doors or alcoves broke the seamless flow of the passage, only the unbroken stretch of silk concealing whatever lay beyond. As they rounded the first bend, however, Rankle's keen eyes caught a discrepancy, a slight shift in the drapery where the wall met the floor, a barely perceptible bulge in the otherwise pristine fabric. He reached out, brushing a gloved hand along the edge of the fabric, hanging against the stone. "There's something behind this," he murmured, pulling the fabric aside to reveal a narrow, concealed doorway, its edges blending almost perfectly with the surrounding masonry. Aurelius stepped closer, pressing his hand against the hidden seam. "A secret passage," he noted. Demi nodded, tightening her grip on Dignity's barb. "Well, left-hand rule dictates we check it out, right?" The party exchanged glances before Marius stepped forward, pushing the hidden door open. They had seen a room like this once before on Axis. It was a room filled with blue mists. Last time, a pair of night hags had made their den in a room such as this. Aurelius cast a gusting sphere spell, which summoned an enduring ball of wind that he could command to move in a pattern across the room to clear the fog. As the sphere did its work, it revealed 2 things. Firstly, that the room was kept misty by 4 silver braziers, one in each corner of the room, that appeared to continuously overflow with the pale blue mist that filled the room, and secondly, that 2 more Sakils were present here. These Sakils did not look like the creatures they had fought previously. They looked like tall, gaunt women, wrapped in thorny vines with tiny red flowers that seemed to grow out of their flesh and flow like a train behind them. As soon as they became partly visible in the fog, they struck. From within the swirling blue haze, long thorny tendrils lashed out like whips, snapping towards them with cruel precision. Marius raised his shield just in time, deflecting the first strike with a resounding clang, but another wrapped around his arm, tightening with an unnatural strength, and pulling him off his feet and into the mist. The Sakils continued to emerge like wraiths from the fog, tall and impossibly thin, their gaunt faces twisted into masks of cruel delight. They moved with a disturbing grace, the tiny red flowers trailing behind them in the air like drifting embers. Aurelius flicked his fingers, directing his gusting sphere to roll through the room, scattering the mist further. "The braziers, shut them down," he called. Demi sidestepped a lashing tendril, ducking low and raising her crossbow. "On it," she shouted, firing a bolt towards one of the braziers. The shot struck true, sending a tremor through the metal basin, but the mist continued to flow. Diyanah moved next, slipping past Marius with a surge of speed. He reached one of the braziers and struck it with a fiery palm strike. The force sent it skidding across the stone floor, the mist spewing erratically before flickering and dimming. Raja leapt forward, his mighty form cutting through the fog as he snapped at the nearest Sakil, his fangs sinking into the thorned vines. The creature let out a sharp hiss and lashed out at him with its other tendril, but Raja dug his claws into the stone, holding his ground. Meanwhile, Rankle twisted away from another lash of the Sakil's tendrils and vanished in a flicker of shadow, reappearing behind one of the braziers. He drove one of his scimitars into the metal, knocking it off balance. The mist here began to thin, reducing the cover their foes had relied on. With 2 of the braziers disrupted, the mist had thinned enough for the heroes to see their enemies more clearly. Marius tore free of the vines constricting his arm and surged forward, slashing out with Coriana's blade. The punch dagger found its mark, biting deep into the Sakil's flesh. Instead of blood, a dark, viscous fluid seeped from the wound, and the creature let out a sharp, otherworldly screech. The Sakil reeled from Marius's strike, its gaunt form trembling as the dark ichor oozed from its wound. But instead of retreating, it let out a rattling laugh and lashed out with its thorn tendril yet again, this time twisting towards Demi and Aurelius. Demi sidestepped with a dancer's grace, the thorned vines scraping against her armored coat but failing to find purchase. Aurelius, however, was not as lucky. One of the tendrils coiled around his wrist, yanking him off his feet. He hissed through clenched teeth, cursing himself for not having an endless supply of mirror image and horrific double spells to stay protected. Diyanah saw the attack and reacted instantly. He surged forward, sweeping his foot in a low spinning kick that knocked the Sakil off balance. Before it could recover, Raja pounced, his massive form colliding with the creature, his fangs closing around its throat. A sickening crunch followed as the great lion shook the prey violently, sending bits of withered vine and flower petals scattered across the floor. The remaining Sakil shrieked, its black eyes darting between the intruders. It reared back and unleashed a horrific wail, an unnatural sound that cut into the mind like a dagger of pure fear. Marius gritted his teeth, fighting against the fear clawing at his mind. "Not today," he growled, and surged forward. With a powerful lunge, he drove Coriana's blade deep into the Sakil's abdomen, twisting the punch dagger as he did. The creature's scream turned into a choked gurgle as dark ichor gushed from the wound. Demi didn't want to give it a chance to recover. She raised Dignity's barb, took aim, and fired a bolt, the laser sight informing her that she should land a killing blow right through the creature's forehead. But the Sakil phased out of reality, going ethereal and disappearing altogether. The bolt bounced harmlessly against the back wall as the last of the mist dissipated, revealing the room in full. Marius looked to Diyanah. "You're the only one that can give chase when they go ethereal like that. Are you going to go after it?" "No, I have to conserve my chi," he said. "Though I guess we have to assume the whole place will be on high alert after this. Gods damn it. Sakils are the worst." Rankle looked around, readying some curative magic. "Everyone still in one piece?" Aurelius flexed his fingers. "I've been better," he said. Rankle stepped over and cast some curing spells to patch him up. Marius looked towards the far end of the room. "Let's keep moving. The sooner we find the Soul Crucible, the better." As the party stepped cautiously towards the second set of doors, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment in the next room, and something sweeter, like honey, laced with an unfamiliar spice. A warm golden light emanated from the walls, where countless stone bookshelves stretched to the ceiling, packed with heavy metal-bound tomes. Against the far wall, 3 massive silver silk cocoons hung like hammocks, swaying gently despite the absence of any breeze. But what drew their eyes first were the statues. 2 massive bees, carved from pink marble, faced each other in the southern half of the room. Their forms were eerily lifelike, with multifaceted gemstone eyes that shimmered in the dim light. Between them sat a low hexagonal plinth, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. Though unmoving, the statues radiated a silent, menacing presence. Then, from one of the cocoons, movement. A figure unfolded herself gracefully, stepping onto the smooth stone floor. She was unlike anything most of them had ever seen. A tall, strikingly beautiful insectoid woman, with golden chitinous skin and gossamer wings that fluttered faintly at her back. Her large, compound eyes caught the light like black pearls, and she regarded them with a gaze that was both knowing and distant. She carried herself with the poise of a queen, yet she seemed shackled to the cocoon throne by long strands of gossamer chain. "You are Fey," said Rankle. "You are one of the Three Seers. You are one of the few remaining creatures in this world and the other, with a true gift of foresight." "Yes, and I have seen you in my visions, Rankle Vythriel," the Three Seer said, her voice melodic, but edged with something unreadable. "You have been a seeker, a challenger, and you have the gift of whimsy to keep a step ahead of fate's unwelcome hands." Her gaze flicked over each of them, lingering on Demi for a moment longer than the others, before settling on Aurelius. "And you bear the mark of one who pries at veiled truths. Tell me then, have you come to steal me away, or merely to unravel what I have woven?" A pause. Aurelius looked about to speak, but she interrupted him. "Know this, before you speak further," she continued, tilting her head ever so slightly. "I am no simple prisoner. I am Drenay, and I regrettably have served as voice of prophecy to those you call your enemies. I wove the threads of your misfortunes. I warned them of your coming. I set the stones of the path upon which you walk. and I," her wings gave a small tremor, "am bound to keep you from leaving this place now that you have entered." As if in response to her words, the gemstone eyes of the bee statues pulsed with light, and a deep grinding sound rumbled through the chamber for a moment. Though the statues did not move yet, their presence was now unmistakably that of wardens. Draenei's lips curled in the barest hint of a smile. "Tell me then, do we speak, or do we test the strength of fate? It was the Fey Huntmaster, Count Baron Bigum, that captured you, wasn't it?" asked Demi, recalling the stories that Nanarina told her about the surviving members of the Immaculate Circle. "You are correct," she said. "His enchantment upon me is quite unbreakable. If you attempt to leave this room, I fear I may have no choice but to kill you all." "And you can do that?" asked Aurelius cautiously. "Bound to that altar, as it were?" Her eyes flicked lazily to the bee statues. "Yes," she answered simply. "Then the answer is clear. We break the enchantment that binds you," said Demi assertively. "Tamper with the magic that holds me, and I will be compelled to defend myself long before you break the spell," she said. "So we're at an impasse?" said Aurelius. "I do pry at veiled truths. You present a riddle to us here." Marius, however, had figured out his own solution to their dilemma. Suddenly and dramatically he surged forward and delivered a powerful knockout blow to the Thray-Seer. His signature move worked like a charm. In one smooth stroke he rendered the seer unconscious. A tense silence followed Marius' sudden strike. Draenei had crumpled like a marionette with its strings cut. Her wings twitched once before falling still. For a heartbeat, the only sound was a soft rustling of her silken cocoon hammocks. "Wizards, oracles, and bards," said Marius, looking to Aurelius, Rankle, and Demi. "You have exactly 4 minutes to break the curse that binds her. If you don't do it by then, I imagine she'll wake up really pissed off." Then the grinding of stone. The gemstone eyes of the bee statues flared with a deep internal glow, and the first of them began to move, dust sifting from its joint as it stepped forward with ponderous inevitability. "Damn it, Marius," Aurelius swore. "You're going to give us time to think of something before—" "She was going to fight us anyway," Marius shot back, rolling his shoulders. "This way she doesn't have any say in it." Rankle's hands were glowing with occult power as he stepped towards Draenei's unconscious form. "Fine, I just need to analyze the enchantment. Demi, help me. If we can pinpoint where the center of the geas lies, I think I can unravel it." Diyanah was already moving, interposing himself between the second statue and Demi. "We'll cover you, just work fast." The first marble bee raised one immense foot to strike, but Aurelius flicked his wrist, conjuring a translucent barrier of force between it and Demi. The golem's heavy limbs struck the shield, sending cracks rippling through the magical field. "This thing is not playing around," Aurelius warned. Rankle, meanwhile, closed his eyes and placed both his hands gently upon Draenei's forehead. Through the numbing layers of the imposed geas he could feel the weight of Goom's magic, heavy as a steel chain. It wasn't simply an order, it was woven into her very perception of reality, compelling obedience as though it were the natural order of the world. "This is going to be complicated," he admitted through clenched teeth. Demi's own detect magic spell was up, studying the gossamer strands that bound the Fey Queen to her altar. "Just stay focused," she hissed to Rankle. "I'll tell you what I see here." Aurelius, dancing backwards to avoid a swiping limb from the second golem, gritted his teeth and tagged Marius on the shoulder with an enlarged person spell. Now he'd have a better chance of preventing his golem from reaching Demi and Rankle. He dealt a series of staggering blows to the stone construct. On the other side, Raja and Diyanah were doing a similar job of keeping the first golem occupied. In the center of it all, Demi and Rankle were beginning to figure it out. Rankle exhaled sharply. "Demi, I'm going to break enchantment here. Work with me to dispel the counterforce. Here and here." Demi nodded, drawing forth the wand of dispel magic. "Let's do it." Together their magic intertwined, Demi's golden song magic merging with Rankle's own eldritch fey power. Their spellwork twisted and spun, and struck at the core of the geas like a surgical blade. And then with a pulse, the enchantment was broken. Draenei gasped, convulsing once before going utterly limp. At the same moment the statues froze, their gemstone eyes dimming, as if an unseen tether had been severed. A stunned silence followed. Then Marius let out a short laugh. "Yes, I told you 4 minutes was enough." Draenei groaned as she stirred, one hand gingerly touching the swelling lump on her forehead where Marius had struck her. She opened her multifaceted eyes, blinking slowly as she took in the scene. Rankle and Demi still brimming with residual magic, the lifeless statues frozen in place, and Marius standing smugly with his arms crossed. "Well," she murmured, pushing herself upright. "That was thoroughly unpleasant." She gave Marius a pointed look. "And rather painful. Marius grinned. "You're welcome." Janae sighed, but to the party's surprise, a faint smile curled her lips. "Despite the rather brutish solution, I must admit, I am impressed. Few have had the strength or the will to undo what Goom wrought upon me. I may not have asked for your help, but you have given me something I never thought possible. Freedom." She exhaled deeply as if shedding the weight of decades. "And for that I am grateful." She rose to her feet, stretching her wings slightly before folding them behind her. "As a seer, I have glimpsed possible futures, and so I offer you my guidance. If you return to the Serpent Corridor, you will find 3 additional hidden passages. The first I urge you to ignore. It leads deeper into the Rusted Dreaming, a realm of twisted horrors, and is of no value to you." The party exchanged glances, but nodded and listened intently. "The second passage leads to the lair of Count Baron Goom, the very one who bound me here. Should you find him, I would be most pleased if you ended him. Consider it a personal favor." Rankle smirked. "Oh, I like her." Janae ignored the comment and pressed on. "The third passage will take you to a lower level, where you will find an alchemical laboratory occupied by the final member of the Immaculate Circle, Travarak Denzani. You should consider taking this route." She narrowed her gaze. "It is one of the quickest ways to reach the Whispering Sanctum and the Soul Crucible." Demi frowned. "You sound as though you're warning us." "I am," Janae said gravely. "When you fought the Sackles earlier, you allowed one to escape." A heavy silence fell over the room. "That creature has not fled in fear," she continued, her voice dropping to a hush. "It has gone to rally the others. They know where you are going, and they are preparing for you. When you reach the Soul Crucible, you will find it empty." Her eyes darkened. "But do not be fooled. They will be there, waiting for you, laying in ambush." Diyanah exhaled sharply. "So we walk into a trap?" Janae inclined her head. "Yes, but forewarned is forearmed. If you are careful, if you are clever, you may yet turn their trap against them." Marius nodded. "I agree. We'll just go in knowing we have to make sure the Sackles regret trying to outmaneuver us." "Then go, and I wish you luck with what remains of your quest." With that, the Thracier cast a plane shift spell, returning to the First World and leaving Panavar's demiplane behind forever. Huntmaster's Quarters, the Rusted Dreaming, Winter 4718. Following Janae's instructions, the party made their way down a series of tunnels, headed towards Count Goom's chambers. The air in the Huntmaster's quarters was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the faint rustle of movement, as the party crept along the stone paths of his territory. As they rounded a corner, they could see that a door had been left slightly ajar, and beyond it a curious sight, an open chamber that appeared to be a makeshift archery range. Tall targets were set up, but instead of the usual wooden dummies or hay bales, small, terrified carbuncles, fey, rabbit-like creatures with gleaming gemstones in their foreheads, were shackled to the targets, their frightened eyes darting around helplessly. Count Baron Goom, standing several paces away, was poised with a longbow, carefully taking sadistic pleasure in the distress of the helpless creatures. He loosed an arrow, the tip finding its mark with cruel precision, piercing one of the carbuncle's hind legs. Demi's face twisted in disgust, her eyes narrowing as her fingers involuntarily tightened around the grip of the crossbow. "This is vile," she muttered under her breath. Before any further words could be exchanged, Rankle, using his characteristic tricks, vanished into the shadows. With an inaudible blink, he reappeared directly behind Goom, his twin scimitars drawn, his eyes gleaming with deadly intent. Without a moment's hesitation, he lunged forward, slashing at the Huntmaster with practiced precision. The first blade met its mark, cutting deep into Goom's back, and he staggered in surprise. His grip on his bow faltered for just an instant. Rankle's second attack came in a swift, fluid motion, but this time the Count had recovered, and his muscles seemed to ripple with unnatural speed as he spun to face his attacker. Goom's eyes gleamed like shards of ice, narrowed with deadly focus. With a sneer, he raised his free hand, summoning a brilliant emerald-hued blade to materialize in the air. It hummed with a strange energy, crackling. In one fluid motion, he lashed out with the ethereal weapon, a whirl of force and magic crashing into Rankle. The rogue twisted out of the way just in time, but the magical blade sliced a deep gash along his arm. "You dare attack me?" Goom spat, his voice laced with contempt, his posture shifting into a more defensive stance. "I am the last of the great lords of the Immaculate Circle, you arrogant little wretch." As if summoned by Goom's rage, the shadows themselves seemed to shift. From the corners of the rooms, 3 figures cloaked in black emerged. Norgorberite assassins, their dark robes shifting like oil in water. Their hoods were drawn low, but their eyes gleamed from beneath, and their hands rested on the hilts of wicked-looking curved daggers. They stepped forward, silent as death itself, clearly intent on finishing what their master had begun. The first assassin lunged forward, but Demi had been faster. She entered the room, and with a twist of her wrist, she unleashed a bolt from her crossbow, the bolt finding its mark and piercing the assassin's side. He grunted, recoiling from the strike, but not falling, his dark eyes blazing with murder. Diyanah surged forward, striding across the stone floor as he aimed a brutal punch towards a second robed killer. His fist collided with the assassin's midsection with a sickening crack. The man gasped, his breath forced out, but with a swift movement he parried Diyanah's follow-up punch and rolled backwards, narrowly avoiding being disarmed. Aurelius, standing back with Demi, focused his energy, his fingers weaving intricate patterns in the air as he called upon his arcane abilities. A shadowy evocation of flames engulfed the room. One assassin tried to dodge, but the blast caught him in the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Before he could stand, Raja had leapt into the room and landed with a crash on the man. But Goom was no fool. As his assassins engaged the party, the Count was already moving, his emerald blade clashing against Rankle's scimitars in a flurry of sparks and steel. Goom's speed was unnerving, each strike a calculated blow that forced Rankle to retreat, giving the Oracle no opportunity to recover his bearings. "You will not win this," Goom sneered, his magical blade flashing as he spoke. "I was born for this." Rankle growled under his breath, frustration mounting as the emerald blade cut through his defenses once again, leaving a deep slash across his side. With a swift motion, he ducked under another swing and dashed backwards, narrowly avoiding a fatal strike. "Come then," Rankle taunted, wiping the blood from his lip with a gloved hand. "I fought worse than you." Meanwhile, Demi, seeing an opportunity, swung her crossbow back into position and aimed it with deadly accuracy at the heart of the nearest Norgorberite assassin. With a decisive pull of the trigger, the bolt flew, and the assassin collapsed in a heap. Marius moved in to press the advantage, leaving Marius to face Goom. The Count snarled, his rage evident. "You think you've won?" he spat, summoning another magical blast of energy from his emerald blade. He struck at Marius, but the half-orc was ready, using his shield to deflect the blow, and then retaliating with a powerful swing of his weapon. With one final coordinated strike, Rankle and Marius closed in together, and Goom, the sadistic huntmaster, was no more. His emerald blade clattered to the floor, before evaporating as his body slumped to the ground. "You know, I can't believe we let Nenarine live, but at least we know we have the last two members of the Circle hiding out here," observed Diyanah. "One down, one to go." Demi made her way over to the last surviving carbuncle with the injured hind leg. Gingerly, she unhooked the fey rabbit from the archery target, and she ran a hand over its head. After a moment it stopped, trembling. "You poor dear," she said. "You know, it's high time I had a pet as well, I think. I think I'm going to name you Cookie," and she gave a sharp look to Diyanah as she said this. "Now that little guy is a cookie," agreed the monk. Alchemical Laboratory, The Rusted Dreaming, Winter, 4718. As the party moved deeper into the rusted dreaming, the air grew thicker with a pungent sense of chemicals and ancient concoctions. The stone walls of the hallway eventually gave way to a large, dimly lit chamber, the soft glow of glass and brass fixtures casting eerie reflections across the room. They had arrived at the Alchemical Laboratory. The sight before them was both mesmerizing and unsettling. A huge glass and brass apparatus stretched across the eastern wall, a chaotic yet meticulous web of beakers, tubes, and bottles, all connected in a vast, elaborate system. Liquid of all colors and viscosities, crimson reds, emerald greens, and icy blues, dripped, bubbled, and sizzled through the tubes in an almost hypnotic rhythm. Wooden shelves and cabinets lined the walls, with every empty space in the bookshelf crammed with stoppered bottles. On the far side of the room, a marble slab table was cluttered with more beakers, flasks, vials, and crucibles, each more complex than the last. A figure, a tall, gaunt silhouette, stood before a large alchemical contraption. His body seemed to shimmer unnaturally, the reflective surface of his form flickering like liquid mercury under the soft light. As the party's eyes adjusted, the horrifying truth became clear. The man before them was no longer entirely human. He had been transformed into a creature of liquid metal, a writhing fluid shape that shifted and rippled, as if his very essence was constantly in flux. The alchemist Travarak Denzarni was no longer the man he once was. His features were almost completely indistinguishable, as his face had melted into a strange, smooth, metallic surface. His hands were moving with unnerving precision as he adjusted the various vials and retorts, as though nothing was out of place. Denzarni's voice, when it came, was the staccato of an absent-minded eccentric. "Ah, visitors! How unexpected!" he murmured, his voice carrying a detached, almost clinical quality. I trust you're not here for my research, or perhaps you have come to join my experiments? I must say, he continued, his yellow eyes narrowing, the results have been quite fascinating, but I suppose you have your reasons for coming. It's not every day one meets a party of adventurers, after all. Perhaps you wish to understand how I have reached this form. We can discuss this, or perhaps we can test your theories against mine. As he spoke, one of his arms raised, and a thin stream of liquid metal extended from his body, forming a makeshift blade that dripped and pulsed with dangerous energy. It was clear that he was fully capable of defending himself, and his alchemical prowess had clearly granted him some horrific new abilities. Marius and Diyanah, who were in the fore, as they typically led the way when the group was moving through hostile enemy territory, didn't know what to do with this, but Aurelius spoke up from behind them. "We're not here to play science partners," he said. "We're here to finally bring an end to the Immaculate Circle." Denzarni's metallic lips twisted into something resembling a smile. "More's the pity, then," he said, his voice quiet but laced with menace. "Because I'm not alone." As if on cue, the shadows around the lab seemed to pulse and stretch. From the darkened corners, shapes emerged, horrific, blood-hungry figures, their bodies slick with alchemical enhancements, their faces twisted in unnatural thirst for blood. These were the same creatures the party had encountered in the entry hall, vampiric abominations birthed from Denzarni's cruel experiments. They surged forward, their eyes glowing with ferocity, their jagged fangs bared in anticipation. Marius reacted first, growling, "I've had enough of these things." Diyanah stepped forward alongside him, his muscles coiling like a spring. "Don't worry, we got this, buddy. The circle dies today." As the alchemical vampires lunged, the battle erupted into a frenzy of motion. Marius met the first of the vampires with a swift strike, his fist colliding with its face, sending it crashing to the floor. The force of the blow caused the entire creature to erupt in a blast of caustic blood, a gruesome sight. But before the detonated chunks of body had even hit the ground, another vampire was already closing in on them, its mouth dripping with hunger. Diyanah and Raja once again moved together, like a whirlwind, his dragon-style martial arts and Raja's leonine ferocity working once again in perfect unison. From the back of the room, Aurelius raised his hands, calling on the powers of the arcane. A gust of wind swirled around him. He was running low on haste spells, but they were the things providing the group's other combatants with the critical edge they needed to continuously fend off these greater odds. His raven, Rodrigo, circled above, screeching and cawing, distracting a few of the vampires long enough for Aurelius to cast his spell. Once the haste spell was up, the advantage quickly shifted towards the heroes. Rankle, who had been silently slipping through the shadows, made his move. With a quick blink, he was on top of one of the vampires, his twin scimitars slashing in deadly arcs. His swift strikes caught the creatures off guard, and they crumpled under his deadly assault. Demi, also hasted, fired a withering barrage of bolts into the metal man. The bolt seemed to blast right through the alchemist, the liquid metal oozing to repair the damage. Nevertheless, it must have caused significant harm, because at this point the Earl began to beat a hasty retreat. Marius disengaged from his vampires and gave chase, attempting to grapple him to prevent him from getting away. Although Marius successfully got his arms around the alchemist, the human ooze began to turn his entire body into liquid sludge, slipping through Marius's grasp. Fortunately, a moment later Diyanah was there, his fists ignited with fire, beating down at the oozing substance until it slowly burned away. As Diyanah's brutal attack began to force the creature to lose cellular cohesion, Denzarni attempted to reform into human shape to survive. It looked monstrous and painful, and Diyanah tried not to think about what strange horror the ooze-man was experiencing as he continued to batter him with flaming fists until he had all burned away. The remaining vampires, meanwhile, had been quickly dispatched by Rankle and Raja. "Time to patch up," said the Dark Elf Oracle, prepping the last of his curative magic. "Last stop here is the Soul Crucible." Whispering Sanctum, The Rusted Dreaming, Winter, 4718. As the party made their way through the labyrinthine corridors of the Rusted Dreaming, they finally reached their penultimate destination, the Whispering Sanctum. The chamber before them was vast, its octagonal shape amplifying the eerie sense of isolation here. 3 wide steps stretched down from each wall, leading to a central platform, where a twisted altar of shadows and whispers stood. The altar seemed to pulse with life, a never-shifting mass of darkness and faint murmurs, a cacophony of voices trapped within its depths, their words unintelligible, but unmistakably present, like so many ghosts clawing at the edges of reality. Here Aurelius took a cautious step forward, his fingers brushing the edge of the swirling darkness. His mind worked quickly as he pieced together the information his spellcraft was revealing to him. He turned to the others. "This altar is part of the Circle's network, a conduit for sending spells, messages, and instructions. If we had made different choices back in Axis, I imagine this would have been the place where we would likely have encountered Panavar Lothide. His words hung in the air like a shadow of what could have been, but the present was far too pressing. The party wasted no time, passing through the last set of doors to continue their relentless pursuit for the Soul Crucible. What lay beyond the Whispering Sanctum was even more bizarre. A room far larger than expected, its walls dominated by strange and alien instruments. At the center of it all stood a massive contraption, crafted from white stone, a vessel large enough for a human to sit inside, balanced precariously atop 3 stone pillars. These pillars were not simple supports. They were fitted with strange lenses and instruments, none of which were familiar to the party. The tub beneath the vessel rippled with milky opalescent fluid, filling the room with a faint earthy sweetness that tugged at the senses. The liquid shimmered as though alive, its surface shifting with a languid, hypnotic motion. The smell clung to the air, cloying and unnerving. It was a scent of something unnatural, something forbidden. The rest of the room stretched out in unsettling silence. Shelves lined the walls, empty save for a single worn journal sitting atop a pile of discarded jars and flasks. Then suddenly what they had been expecting here, thanks to the Thraceer's warning: the Sakil ambush. It began with a low clicking sound echoing from the shadows, followed by a sharp screeching hiss. From the corners of the room a dark swarm erupted. Emerging from the ethereal plane where they had been hiding, Ichko Sakils, these creatures were as revolting to behold as ever, with their hard, chitinous exoskeletons resembling cockroaches, but their faces of twisted, ugly humans, wide, staring eyes, and cruel, sharp-toothed mouths. They scuttled across the floor with unnatural speed, their mandibles snapping as they closed in on the party with primal hunger. Before anyone could react, from the far side of the chamber, Pakalchi Sakils emerged. Tall, gaunt figures, their sinewy bodies entwined with vicious, thorny vines. The vines snaked around their limbs and torsos, some of them dripping with a sticky black substance that hissed when it touched the floor. Then, just as the party had readied itself to meet these ambushing predators, a terrible roar echoed through the chamber, the very floor trembling beneath them. From the center of the room, an enormous creature emerged, a Zimtal Sakil, a gargantuan, crab-like monstrosity, its jagged carapace gleaming in the dim light, its pincers snapping and crackling with an unsettling, eerie force. But what truly made it terrifying was the aura of pure dread that emanated from it. The moment its monstrous form loomed into view, the temperature seemed to drop, and an overwhelming sense of isolation and fear crept into the hearts of the heroes. Those who met its eyes found themselves gripped by a suffocating loneliness, a terrifying sense of abandonment that gnawed at their very souls. Demi began to sing, and Diyanah unfurled the standard of conquest. Both her battle song and the standard's aura served to immunize the party from the supernatural fear aura of the Sakils. The room soon became a bloody battlefield, swarming with Sakils of all forms. The Ichko scurried and slashed with their sharp limbs, their foul faces grinning in malicious glee. The Pakalchi lashed out with thorn-covered tendrils, trying to ensnare and bind the party. Meanwhile, the Zimtal loomed in the center, its terrifying presence casting a shadow over everything, while its great claws stretched out to crush any that might dare come too close. Aurelius had a readied action prepared for such a situation as well, his final casting of haste. Rankle also prepared for a long fight. He summoned forth not one ancestral scimitar, but 2 separate magical scimitars that each struck out of their own accord. Then he darted towards the Ichko Sakils, his own very real blades flashing as he sliced through the air with practiced ease, his quick strikes taking down one of the scuttling horrors, but he knew there were more to come. Demi, seeing that Rankle might get quickly overwhelmed, raised her crossbow, aiming at the Ichkos as well. She fired, her bolts striking at the creature's ugly human faces. She also used the magic of a relic blade to intercept a ranged projectile vine that shot out from one of the Pakalchis towards Aurelius. Marius was more worried about the Pakalchi than the Ichko. He charged into the fray against them, slamming one of the gaunt horrors with his shield, the thorn scraping against his armor as he pushed forward with all his might. The creature hissed in pain, but recoiled slightly, its vines wrapping around Marius in a desperate attempt to drag him into its grasp. Diyanah leapt onto the back of Raja. He activated the dire collar. Even as Aurelius's Raven Rodrigo tagged him on the back with an enlarged person spell. Even so grown, Diyanah and Raja were dwarfed by the Zimtal. This did not stop them. Diyanah's heart pounded in his chest as he guided Raja straight towards the colossal behemoth. The monstrous crab creature loomed before them as its hulking form cast a long shadow that seemed to swallow up the light in the chamber, its massive pincers clacking ominously before him. Despite the overwhelming fear that washed over him, Diyanah's grip tightened on Raja's mane as he focused on calling upon his last inner reserve of mystical chi. Raja launched forward, teeth bared and claws ready to rake across the Zimtal's armored exoskeleton, while Diyanah, his bald head gleaming in the dim light, aimed a mighty blow at the creature's underbelly with his fists, wrapped in the golden flames of the dragon style. His strikes landed with crippling force, each blow powered by his martial discipline and the raw, unbridled energy of his chi. The Zimtal reared back, its pincers snapping towards them with terrifying speed. The first pincer strike missed, but the second came down in a crushing arc. Diyanah barely had time to roll with a hit, his arm taking the brunt of the blow, but he kept his feet, gritting his teeth again in pain. Raja, ever faithful, lunged forward again, his claws sinking deep into the creature's tough shell. Diyanah leapt from Raja's back, twisting in midair, rolling along the ground, and then landing a devastating series of blows to the Zimtal's underbelly, each punch driving deeper as the sound of crunching exoskeleton filled the air. The Sakil monster screeched in fury, its body writhing and thrashing, but Diyanah was relentless. His strikes continued to rain down on the creature, focused, powerful, unyielding. Despite the fear that threatened to claw at his resolve, Diyanah felt something else rise within him. That Frascati confidence he had been born to. He was no mere man to quake in his boots. He was a master of the dragon style, a scion of one of the great houses of Taldor, certainly the house with the best wine in Taldor. It was time to end this abomination once and for all. Raja, fighting fiercely alongside him, tore at Zimtal's defenses, distracting the creature long enough for Diyanah to deliver a final blow. With a focused strike, Diyanah's fist connected squarely with the Zimtal's vulnerable underbelly, shattering its defenses and causing the beast to let out a final earth-shattering screech. The creature's massive form collapsed, lifeless, into a heap, and for a moment Diyanah stood still, chest heaving, as the echoes of the battle faded away. The fear that had once gripped him now seemed distant. Diyanah turned to Raja, his heart still racing, and gave his lion companion a pat of gratitude. He looked across the hall. He was not the only one to have risen to the occasion in that final battle. Marius had carved a path of ruin through the Pakalchi Sakils, while Aurelius had blasted them apart with well-placed shadow evocation fireballs. Rankle and Demi had torn apart the Ichkos. Any Sakils not destroyed by the party had slinked back to the ethereal plane. They would think twice before confronting them again. The Soul Crucible, the Rusted Dreaming, Winter 4718. Demi thumbed through the journal near the arcane device. There were tons of details here, penned in Vadragan's elaborate script. Demi and Aurelius took the lead here. Demi focused on reading the journal, her android eyes consuming the data faster than any human might be able to. She skimmed ahead. She just needed the functions of the device, not all the theory. Aurelius focused on the device itself, trying to understand how all the parts of it might work. "Okay," she said. "Here's how it works. There should be a canister of some stuff that might look like a kind of milk, and it loads into that compartment there." "There's one in the compartment all ready to go," observed Aurelius. "And it looks like there's 2 more canisters on the shelf over there, if this doesn't work the first time." "Great," said Demi. "Now there should be 2 basins. This large central basin below is where the body will be, to use Vadragan's term, printed. The second, smaller one here," she indicated another small basin on the crucible, "is called the soul receptacle. This is where Panavar would have placed the poppet containing Carius' soul during the resurrection." "So that's where we put Taldogus, right?" said Aurelius. "I think so," replied Demi. Aurelius drew the small figurine of Taldogus from his pack and placed it in the basin. "She had an attachment to the dog, not the figurine," noted Demi. "We should bring him back." "Right, I'm just worried he'll be agitated. He was pretty distressed back at the Palace of Birdsong." I think I can calm him down," said Diyanah. Ever since Diyanah had taken lessons from Anlel and bonded with Raja, he had developed a kind of druidic wild empathy, which made him quite good with animals. Aurelius nodded, and he summoned Taldogus. Sure enough, the dog was quite agitated. The environment was frightening, and there were dead creatures of horror that littered this strange chamber. But Diyanah's soothing words did the trick, and after a moment Taldogus agreed to sit quietly, like a good boy, in the soul receptacle basin. "Now we simply turn it on," said Demi. Aurelius did the honors and flipped the switch. After a moment, the soul crucible came to life. Images poured forth from the device. A flickering parade of childhood memories spilled over the vessel's lips. Princess Eutropia's life unfurled in fragments, the heartbreaks and triumphs, friendships and losses that had shaped her spirit into the woman they had known. Glimpses of a young Eutropia and Carius playing at knights and dragons flickered alongside scenes of them reading together at the imperial palace. Yet the brightest and most piercing memory was one of sorrow. The moment Eutropia stood beside her brother's body at his funeral, the grief on her face mingled with determination, burning brighter than all the other facets of her soul, a defining moment that had set her on her path. As these echoes of the past played out in the shimmering air, the soul crucible's mirrored projectors cast reflections of the memories across the chamber. Meanwhile, within the central basin, a series of long, silvered arms whirred to life. Moving with mechanical precision, they assembled a skeletal structure, then layered muscle over bone, and finally stitched everything together beneath a thin layer of skin. The entire process was eerily methodical, both scientific and arcane in nature, creation itself distilled into a formula by the work of the Immaculate Circle. Then, with a sudden, gasping breath, the newly formed body stirred, a young, fragile-looking woman, naked and trembling, opening her eyes. Eutropia had returned. She looked around in confusion and horror, and then Taldogus barked, and she laughed, and she cried, and she simply said, "I'm alive again. How am I alive again?" "We simply turned the ingenuity of our own enemy against them," said Aurelius, as he draped the mantle of kings over her to protect her modesty, but also privately to make sure this new version of her was still worthy of the throne. It was with some relief that he saw the mantle glow as she wrapped it around herself. "You are standing in the Soul Crucible," explained Demi. "This was how Panevar and Vadrigan were able to resurrect your brother Carius." "Eutropia, we got a lot to catch you up on," said Diyanah. "But now that I know this doohickey works, I need to run. We lost someone on our way in, and I fully intend to use another batch of that resurrection goo to bring our friend back. You all catch her up. I'll be back with Sepsinia and Galindra." With that, Diyanah and Raja were off, bounding through the halls of that profane demiplane, headed for where they had left the gate open in the Encircling Bower. While Diyanah was gone, Aurelius, Marius, and Rankle caught up Eutropia on what they had missed. That she had been assassinated by a killer from the cult of Norgorber less than an hour after they had killed Pytherius. That Panevar Lothide, the leader of the Immaculate Circle, had left in place contingencies should his puppet Pytherius meet an untimely end. And that one of these contingencies was the tampering he had done with the soul of her brother Carius. Reading through the journal, Demi now had a better understanding of what had been done specifically. "Firstly, it's as we feared," said the android. "Panevar gave Vadrigan specific instructions for how to guarantee that Carius would ultimately act in a way compliant with his wishes. He carved out a sliver of his own soul and placed it within Carius. This sliver was to lie dormant until Carius ascended to the throne, so as not to arise suspicion that the boy wasn't who the Immaculate Circle claimed him to be." Eutropia looked at Demi. "I can't lose him again. I simply can't. I've spent time with him. I know it's really Carius. It's just this one small corruption. Can't we find a way to exorcise this last sliver of Panevar from my brother so he can be himself again?" "That's where it gets tricky," said Demi. "Panevar foresaw that someone might try to perform some kind of exorcism. So, firstly, he buried himself quite deep, and secondly, he's protected himself with a kind of quintessent firewall of sorts." Aurelius gave her a confused look. "You're using some kind of androphon terminology there, Demi. Can you explain that in a different way?" "Yes, of course," said Demi. "Panevar and Vadrigan created a spiritual security system of sorts to prevent any kind of exorcism from taking place. They refer to it in the notes as the Six Legend Soul, or the Six Legend Seal. Based on these notes, I know they were both avid collectors of soul stuff. For example, when Norgorber's herald captured First Emperor Taldaris, he sold Panevar a sliver of Taldaris's own soul. Well, Taldaris's soul wasn't the only one these greedy Immaculate Circle bastards got their hands on. The seal that insulates Panevar's soul from exorcism is comprised of soul stuff stolen from 6 legendary emperors from Taldor's storied past. Emperor Taldaris, Emperor Syricus, Emperor Daronlia the Overthrower, Emperor Beldam I, Emperor Genaris III, and finally your own great-grandfather, Emperor Stavian I. The theory that Panevar and Vadrigan had was that each of these souls would not just protect the soul of Panevar, but also Carius could draw on the collective wisdom of these great emperors to be the greatest leader Taldor would ever know. In any case, to liberate Carius, each one would need to be exorcised in turn for us to even get access to the last hidden piece of Panevar that he has kept buried in Carius." "How would we even begin to do that?" asked Eutropia. "Well, the good news is we already have the tools in our possession," said Demi. "Panevar's signet ring, the same one that could be used to enter this place, his private demiplane, is also the device he used to access our dreams and analyze our own souls when we enter the Palace of Birdsong. If we get close enough to Carius, we can activate it to enter Carius's mindscape. There we can commune with the souls. Perhaps we can simply convince them to leave. If not, Rankle's occult powers may be of use here to help drive out the spirits by force." Just then Diyanah came back through the door. He was carrying the broken, battered form of Galindra, and jogging along behind him was Sepsinia and Pepper Pig. Although she knew she would be there, Sepsinia was still surprised to see a half-naked princess draped in Aurelius's glowing lionskin cloak. She stopped short and did a fine curtsy. "Your Majesty," said Sepsinia awkwardly. Then she put up a finger in the air and said, "Oh, wait, I can help with this. I know a fabricate clothes spell." "You never know when you might need a quick change of wardrobe." After a moment of fumbling around and chatting to Pepper in their own private way, she performed a short conjuration ritual and summoned an appropriate dress for Eutropia, along with a simple brown cloak to wear over it for warmth. The boys turned around while Eutropia got changed into Sepsinia's summoned dress. It was a reasonably good fit. While this was going on, Demi helped Diyanah with Galindra. "We don't need to print a new body for Galindra. Just repair the old one. Place her fully in the main basin," instructed Demi. She loaded a fresh cartridge of the magical soul goop and then activated the device. This time the device filled the tub with the material, and it seemed to be absorbed by Galindra's body, healing all of her injuries. A few moments later, she was back alive, and Sepsinia gave her a big hug. "We have one final vial of magic resurrection liquid," said Diyanah. "Anybody else we need to bring back?" "Volto?" asked Aurelius. Diyanah gritted his teeth. "Volto died weeks ago, well before the Battle of Maheto, while we were faffing around with Haujin and Axis. I have to imagine we're too late for him. He will have been judged and his soul will have moved on already." Aurelius nodded, realizing that Diyanah was most probably right about this. "I have a rather selfish proposal," said Demi. "It's now very close to my birthday. It's actually the day after tomorrow. I'll be turning 89. I now have a much better understanding of the android condition. As we live, our souls fill up with experiences. When our souls are sufficiently full, our spirits start to affect our decision-making cogitators. We suddenly want to end, so as to allow that full soul to enter the river and be judged. But I don't want that to happen just yet, and I believe I could use the Soul Crucible to reboot my soul's understanding of its own weight, reset it so my soul thinks it's new, while retaining my own memories and experiences. Essentially, I'd be giving myself another 100 years to experience life as a mortal." She looked awkwardly at the others. "I know you're all human, and you all are unlikely to live even 100 years, so it probably seems like a waste of this resurrection material to extend my own life for yet another 100 years. But I feel so close to the end now, and I'm really not ready to go." Marius spoke for the party now, putting a hand on her shoulder. "That's not selfish at all. Tell us what to do, and we'll help you do it." "Thank you all," she said, tears now forming in her synthetic eyes. "You are the best friends an android could ask for." End of chapter. Hi there, thank you so much for watching. You've just watched Season 6, Episode 3 of my Pathfinder 616 War for the Crown series. This episode is called The Rusted Dreaming, which is the name I ended up giving to Panavar's Demi-plane. It has a slightly different name in the books. I think they're called the Shadowed Circles, and it's structurally slightly different, but the actual dungeon that I used is identical, and there were a few changes that I made. The main change that I made throughout this dungeon is, obviously in the original, this is where you meet Panavar Lothid. Also, Nenarina Della is a major villain in this as well. So there's the two last members of the Immaculate Circle that we encounter here, which is Goom and Denzarni. And then there's Nenarina Della, and then finally you have your ultimate boss, which is you encounter Panavar Lothid here. Because we had defeated him earlier, I needed a different kind of capstone enemy at the end of the dungeon. And Panavar has long had this alliance with the Sackils, so I peppered a few more Sackils throughout the dungeon as well. There are more in this version of the dungeon than there are in the books. I decided I was going to put a Zimtal Sackil, which is the enormous kind of crab-like creature that they fight at the end, and he effectively served to give a really epic kind of final encounter to this dungeon that Panavar would have served otherwise. All of the events in this dungeon are cool. I think this is a pretty cool final dungeon for this kind of high-level adventure. I think that both Goom and Denzarni are interesting villains. I particularly enjoyed Goom and his kind of Fey connection. The captured the Thracier is a cool encounter. That's another one that had the potential of going sideways, and Marius's knockout blow there kind of shifted that encounter rather suddenly and abruptly, and that ended up being a lot of fun to play at the table. Sometimes, your players will surprise you like that. That does seem like a Diyanah move, but it was good. It was good, and sometimes stuff like that kind of keeps the kinetic energy up, right? When players will surprise you like that. So I do encourage that sort of thing at my game table, players taking initiative without having to discuss everything that's going to happen. Then finally, after defeating the Zimtal, they do acquire, or they get access to the Soul Crucible, and they are able to resurrect Eutropia. Here's another subtle difference between my version of events and the version of events as scripted. In the version of events as scripted, Eutropia has a necklace that ends up absorbing a part of her soul, and then Taldogus somehow knows that the necklace is important, and he like bites the necklace, and it's in his mouth, and then he gets killed in the scuffle with the assassin, and the heroes find the corpse of Taldogus, and they use the necklace to resurrect the princess instead of Taldogus himself. And I didn't want to kill Taldogus; he's too cute. So I I changed it, and I was just like, anything that Eutropia would have imprinted on will do. In fact, I didn't even mention what had happened to Taldogus, and then Aurelius, entirely of his own volition, was like, let's get Taldogus. And I was like, that's awesome. Let's make Taldogus the thing that brings back the princess. So that's a little subtle difference. But otherwise, this more or less plays exactly as it does in the books. They resurrect the princess. Demi reads through the notes, and she learns all about the six-legend soul. Here's another subtle difference between my version of events, and I'll probably talk about this more in my final concluding chapter. But in the book as written, there is not a sliver of Panavar that is hidden beneath the six-legend soul. The six-legend soul exists to keep Carius' soul together, because Carius' soul was malformed when they resurrected him, and so the kind of corruption that's happening in Carius is kind of an accident, and I didn't like that as being the motivating force. Panavar has always been my big bad in this adventure, and so even though Panavar is gone, his machinations survive him, and I really wanted him directly responsible for this. So the sliver of Panavar's soul being hidden behind the six-legend soul is my addition, and I think it makes the it makes the villain more clear. And makes the final encounter more interesting. But we'll talk more about that when I get to finally encountering Carius in the next couple of episodes. That's all I got for you today. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you very soon for more War for the Crown.